Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be taking a closer look at one of the most fascinating and, yes, even debated figures in American history, George Washington. We all know Washington is the commanding general of the Continental Army, the nation's first president, and the father of his country. But his story is also inseparable from one of the greatest contradictions in American history, that is slavery. And we have brought on Chris, I think, one of the best guests to talk about George Washington and the issue of slavery, and that is Dr. John Garrison Marks.
Yes, I think that our listeners are going to find a conversation to be very fascinating, especially as we are uh, remembering 250 years of American history. And that's one of the things that Dr. Marks is going to try to focus on in his new book, which is trying to fight for this understanding of American memory and the understanding of history and memory. And so, using George Washington and this uh, very serious issue regarding slavery during his time and his thoughts on it, both public as well as private. I think this podcast will allow our listeners to do a deep dive into some really cool history that maybe you didn't know but should.
Yeah, and he goes beyond, as you said, he goes beyond in his book, just simply talking about George Washington and slavery. There are a lot of books and stuff that talk about that. He gets into the issue of memory. How do people remember George Washington in connection with slavery, both during his life, in the years following his death, all the way up, to the modern era? How do people think about George Washington when it comes to slavery? And of course, it was a big issue starting in 2020. Well, not starting in 2020, but a big issue in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter protests and, of course, the statues and everything like that. And there was a lot of questions about George Washington, his relationship with slavery, and how Americans today should think about that.
And so, as we prepare to celebrate July 4th, it's a great reminder, going back to the words of Frederick Douglass, what is to the slave the 4th of July. And so it allows us this opportunity to do a deep dive as we prepare to celebrate our country and to understand the importance of fighting for memory.
Yes, absolutely. And we did a podcast on that episode a long time ago. This, Chris, was our 189th episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. So we're coming up on a very big anniversary as well, the 200th episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. Well, anyway, our guest today is Dr. John Garrison Mark, historian, writer, and author of the new book, Thy Will Be Done, George Washington's Legacy of Slavery and the Fight for American Memory. In addition to his books, Dr. Marks has written Dr. Mark's writing has appeared in the Washington Post, Times, Smithsonian Magazine, and other publications. He also serves as a senior staff member with the American Association for State and Local History, where he leads research, leadership development, special projects, including years of work surrounding America's upcoming 250th anniversary. Dr. Marks earned his PhD in history from Rice University. So let's join the interview with Dr. John Merritt Garrison Marks. Okay, we are here with Dr. John Garrison Marks, the author of the book George Washington's Legacy of Slavery and the Fight for American Memory. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Marks.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So, just sort of to get things started here, what sort of sparked your interest in this topic, the topic of Washington, slavery, and American memory, how this is all remembered?
Yeah, it was kind of a long path that brought me to this book, and it wasn't really the book that I thought I was setting out to write when I started. So the first kind of spark that got me interested in this is thinking about the people that Washington freed from slavery in his last will and testament. I didn't learn about that at all until I was in graduate school, I think, and that always struck me as kind of strange. And my scholarly background is as a historian of slavery and really as a historian of free Black Southerners before the abolition of slavery. And it really struck me as I started reading into this emancipation from George Washington that so little had been written about the people that he freed from slavery after they become free. It is always the last couple pages maybe a couple paragraphs in a book about George Washington. And I really wanted to know what it would look like if instead I put that at the beginning of a story about free Black life in early 19th century Virginia. And so that was sort of the first thing that I thought about, and that was kind of the book that I had initially set out to write. And as I began researching that, trying to find these sort of scraps of evidence about this group of 123 people that Washington freed from slavery in his will, I found very little about them. But I found all of these people in the 19th century who were talking about Washington's will and talking about this emancipation and talking about it in these really often kind of diametrically opposed ways. And I became really fascinated by that, of why did this hold such interest for people in the 19th century, and how long did that continue? And so I had that sort of idea in my head that there might be something there. And then it was really in the summer of 2020, kind of two things that gave me the final push to really work on this as a book project. One is I began working in my current role at the American Association for State and Local History in 2017, and had started working on the 250th anniversary. So I've now been planning for helping organizations, helping museums and historic sites plan for that anniversary for almost a decade now. No one has been looking forward to July 4th, 2026 more than me, I can promise you. But I knew that there would hopefully be this kind of moment of reflection and reassessment and interest in the founders and in their relationships with slavery. And so I kind of thought there would be something there with this book. And then in the summer of 2020, we saw this huge movement for racial justice, these demonstrations and protests that so often came to focus on George Washington as this symbol of racial injustice and oppression in the United States. And that's where I opened the book, is on some of these demonstrations that really came to focus on Washington's role in perpetuating racial injustice in America. And it kind of struck me that the conversation we were having in 2020 looked so much like the conversation that people were having in the first half of the 19th century. And so that's when I really started to dig in and try to explore how this conversation has changed over time, and really how and why this conversation has remained the same across all of these different eras of American history.
Dr. Marks, one of the things you were talking about is just looking at Washington as a champion of liberty, but also with the reality that he owned enslaved people. And, how should we reconcile his role as being that champion, but also being one who kind of did the opposite of what was right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the question that Americans have been struggling with for almost the entirety of 250 years of our history as a nation. It is really complicated and really frustrating to engage with this history, because Washington's involvement in slavery and the things that he writes privately about abolition and emancipation are so opposed to one another that it sort of defies belief that these could be coming from the same person. It would be really easy if this was kind of a redemption story, right? And some people like to tell it that way, that Washington was born into a world where enslaving people of African descent was the norm. He came to lead a revolution and a nation predicated on these ideals of liberty and equality among human beings, saw the error of his ways, and in his last will and testament comes to free the people that he enslaved. That's a pretty tidy story. It's a pretty straight line, but that's just not how it played out. And history is almost never that easy for us, right? And in fact, Washington was contradicting himself all the time. He was actively involved in the institution of slavery for the entirety of his adult life. For basically 5 decades, he was enslaving other human beings. Really, right up until the very end of his life, he is still buying and selling people. He is exploiting their labor for his personal gain. He is endlessly pursuing those who try to run away from him, try to escape their enslavement, and in fact expresses kind of astonishment and betrayal that they would be so ungrateful as to try to escape their enslavement to him. And this is happening all the way into the late 1790s. He dies in 1799. And yet, at the very same time, he is writing privately to people all throughout his life, or throughout the last 3 decades of his life, especially in the years after the Revolution, about his own uneasiness with his involvement in slavery, about his growing opposition to certain aspects of the institution. He says that he doesn't want to separate families, which happens again, time and again under American slavery. He says he doesn't want to buy and sell human beings as you would cattle in the market, is how he put it. Um, he comes to really express this wish that he could extricate himself from the slave system. He expresses this desire to see slavery gradually abolished in the United States. He expresses his support privately to for these northern gradual abolition laws that he sees all throughout the United States North, beginning in the 1780s. And he's doing these things at the same time before, on his deathbed, in his last will and testament, he frees the people that he enslaved and owned outright. And there is just no way of reconciling those two stories. And what I talk to audiences about, and what I say in the book, is that what we need to be able to do, which is incredibly difficult, is to embrace the ambiguity and complexity that there is in that story. Oftentimes, history just doesn't have as many answers for us as we would like it to. It's great when history can kind of give us a clear signal about how things were, but most of the time, it lives in these gray areas, and that's certainly the case with Washington's history with slavery. And I think the most important thing is that we try to get our heads around all of it and try to engage with the complexity that is there, both what he said privately, what he did in his last will and testament, but also his decades of active involvement in the slave system. We've seen time and again in American history people trying to use parts of that story and have it stand in as the whole thing. But the reality is that it was complex, and trying to embrace the whole thing and truly understand it demands that we get more comfortable than we usually are with ambiguity.
Yeah, and one of the things I did want to ask you about was the will. Yeah, his last will and testament. You mentioned it a little bit there, because as you said, through the 1790s, 1780s, he is saying these things privately, expressing discontent about slavery and even to some degree his own involvement in it. But in his last will and testament, he sort of does the very thing he said he didn't want to do, that is, divide families, because, as you know, a lot of the slaves on his various farms did not belong to him outright. So can you talk about that a little bit, that how he doesn't do anything publicly until after he dies?
Yeah, for his entire time as general, as president, he never speaks publicly about slavery. I think he recognizes that it is already this live wire in American politics, this lightning rod that threatens to disrupt this project in representative democracy. And so he always prioritizes the unity and stability of this new nation over the rights of enslaved people. But the most important thing to understand about his personal involvement in slavery, particularly as it plays out at Mount Vernon, his plantation in Virginia, is that more than half of the people that were enslaved at Mount Vernon were not owned outright by George Washington. They were owned effectively by Martha Washington. I'll try not to get us too bogged down in 18th century property law, but effectively, Martha Washington was married before she married George Washington. Her first husband dies, and he dies possessing hundreds of enslaved people. Essentially, those become Martha Washington's property during her life. But as a woman in 18th century Virginia, she needs a man to kind of take stewardship over that property. So during her marriage to George Washington, he is effectively in control over all of the 300 plus enslaved people at Mount Vernon, but he is only the legal owner of 123 of them when he dies. And he writes in his will that he will emancipate all of the people that he enslaves and owns outright. And he says that they will get their freedom both when he dies and when Martha Washington dies. And he puts in there explicitly that the reason he is delaying this for so long is because there are so many relationships that cross this line between Martha Washington, the people Martha Washington enslaved, the dower slaves, and the people George Washington enslaved. There are marriages that cross that line, friendships. There are many, children that, have one parent on one side and one parent on the other side. And he recognizes that emancipating the people that he owned outright was going to sever those relationships. But I think he also knew that once he died and Martha Washington died, that was going to happen no matter what. The dower slaves were going to be dispersed to the heirs of Martha Washington's first husband, and the people that Washington owned were going to be dispersed to his heirs. And those relationships were going to be disrupted after both of their deaths. And so he wants to emancipate these people. And he uses his will, which is a fairly conventional way of doing it in late 18th century Virginia. And we can get into more of that if you want to. But he decides to delay it this long because he knows there's no more avoiding that separation of families once they are both dead. Unfortunately, this leaves Martha Washington in a pretty uneasy position. She recognizes pretty quickly two things. One is that George Washington wrote for years before his death that he thought he enslaved twice as many people as he could profitably employ at Mount Vernon. But because of his personal opposition to separating families and to selling enslaved people, he didn't do that, didn't try to reduce his holdings by selling people off. But he, was kind of casting about for a solution. He said that, I need some kind of solution or I'll be ruined. And when he dies and says that the people he enslaved would still belong to Martha until she died, she kind of inherits those financial problems as well. And so George Washington's nephew, Bushrod, is one of the executors of the will. And he tells her within a couple of weeks, like, you should rid yourself of plantation cares and troubles, including these people. But she also realized that more than 123 people knew that the only thing standing between them and freedom was Martha Washington being alive. And she recognized that that put her in a pretty precarious position as well. So within a couple weeks of Washington's death, she announces, and it gets published in the newspaper and republished again and again, that she would free them at the end of the year 1800, kind of gave a year that they would remain enslaved, where she was kind of getting affairs in order. And then January 1st, 1801, they would gain their freedom.
So I want to go just a different direction if I can, and that goes to the title of your book, which I think is just fascinating. And Thy Will Be Done, but then the fight for American memory is something that really struck me. And I wondered if you could, and I know the last thing I want to do is ask a multi-pronged question but I'm going that way. If you can just talk a little bit about the difference of, memory and history and what's the difference there for our listeners? And then, do you think that we are celebrating this 250th anniversary? You are so excited about it. We're so excited about it. And do you think that this is one of the most significant periods of maybe historical reinterpretation that we're starting to see with such political charge in so many things that's going on? And I'd just like to kind of get your thought process of kind of where the title of the book came from, and then kind of leading into who we are as a people today, trying to see history for what it was and for what it should be. And I am so sorry for this really long-winded question on that.
No, I appreciate it. I was an academic for long enough that I can handle a multi-part question. So the title of the book, the main title, "Thy Will Be Done," is in part because we for so long talked about George Washington as the father of his country, and so much of the book focuses specifically on his will and how people have interpreted it over time. And so that kind of play on words, that symbolism, just sort of came to me as I was researching the book. But then it was also, and this gets into the fight for American memory part. So many people over the course of the last 250 years have claimed that they are speaking for Washington, or that they understand Washington's true intentions in something he said or something he did. And they claim that Washington would have supported whatever political project or kind of cultural movement they are trying to lead. So there are all of these people who are invoking Washington in these various ways, claiming that they are sort of carrying out his will in one way or another, and using his involvement with slavery, usually a kind of distorted view of that history, in order to make those points. And that's a big part of what the book tries to do. And really, that is what I wanted to that's the story that I wanted to tell with this book, is that these fights over what Washington's involvement with slavery actually was, and how we should understand his involvement with slavery. And when we talk about George Washington's legacy, those conversations have been happening for centuries. They were started happening while Washington was still alive, and they've essentially never let up in the centuries since. And I know for a lot of people, especially between 2020 and now, or between the publication of the 1619 Project and now, it has felt new and controversial and unprecedented to say that now is the time we need to grapple with Washington's history as an enslaver, and we certainly still do. But there have been other people all through American history who have been making that very same argument and saying that this is what Washington's history with slavery means. And there have been other Americans, their contemporaries, who claim the opposite, claims that his history should mean something else to us, or that we shouldn't pay attention to his history with slavery at all. And that kind of controversy and argument has been happening again and again, and those are the stories that I try to tell in the book. And as I mentioned at the outset here, in terms of kind of what motivated me to write this book, a big part of it was thinking about the 250th anniversary and the opportunities that this would create for people to gain a deeper understanding of our history, to participate in some self-reflection and national reflection on where we've been and where we want to see things going in the future. I think these anniversaries really matter for a lot of people. I tend to think of it in much the same way people think about New Year's or think about their birthday, right? That it's this moment in time that you can say, okay, survey the landscape, look at where you've been for the last year or last 250 years, and say, this is where we've arrived now, and this is where we want to see things go in the future. And I've been really encouraged by how much great work is happening at the state and local level to help communities work through that process, to do exhibits and conversation programs and all sorts of different kinds of activities and things that is bringing people together to think about history in a new way, maybe introduce them to ideas that they hadn't thought about before, things that we've learned between the bicentennial and now, that has changed the way that we talk about the past, that maybe haven't sort of pierced the broader public understanding of our national past. I think the 250th is proving to be a really important way of doing that. I think there is a lot left to be desired by the way the federal planning has approached this anniversary. I don't think there's a particularly high degree of historical reflection happening in a UFC fight at the White House, but what is happening elsewhere at the state and local level, hopefully won't be overshadowed by some of that spectacle that we're seeing here in Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great time to be teaching American history, though, especially American History 1, because students, there's that connection that you can make with the students. We're now at the 250th, and it does cause them to ask questions. I want to stick with the theme of memory here. One of the things that you talk about in your book is that there were many Americans in the years following Washington's death who sort of downplayed his connection with slavery. They didn't really want to talk about it too much. But then at the same time, especially in the African American community in the area of obituaries, um, they were not only talking about it, they were making claims to be, a slave that Washington had freed. Sometimes some of those claims were quite absurd, considering how old it would make them. And you even, I think, brought up the lady with P.T. Barnum and her connection there. Can you talk a little bit about that contrast? Whereas on one hand, you have a lot of people who are trying to downplay his involvement in slavery, but on the other hand, you have a lot of African Americans who were trying to connect themselves with George Washington.
Yeah, and the ways that people do this changes a lot over time. It always kind of ebbs and flows based on the political and cultural context of a particular period. So in the immediate aftermath of George Washington's death, there are a lot of particularly white Americans who are really worried about the future of the nation, right? No one did more than George Washington to bring the nation into being. No one did more than Washington to keep this collection of states tied together. And there was a lot of people that worried that Washington's death was going to bring that whole project crashing to the ground, that he was the only thing that was holding the country together. And people recognized, too, that slavery was already this contentious issue, and using that moment, and using the example that he left of emancipation in his will to talk about George Washington and slavery was only going to make that process of keeping the nation together more difficult. And so instead, what we see happen in the eulogies that get delivered right after Washington dies, in all the biographies that begin to get published in the years and decade or so after Washington dies, is this tendency to lift Washington up as a symbol, to really turn him into something more than a fallible human being, and instead to really kind of cement him as the father of his country. They emphasize his virtue, they emphasize these kind of personal characteristics that they thought should exemplify what it means to be American, should show people, this kind of common cause that they have across all of these different states as a way of reminding people that they are all equally invested in this American project. But also, right away, you see some African Americans begin to use Washington and his involvement with slavery, and specifically his decision to free the people that he enslaved in his will, as a way of staking their own claims to liberty and equality, and staking their own claims to say that these ideals from the Declaration should apply to African Americans as well. So the best example is Richard Allen, who's a African American born into slavery. He is a preacher, a minister in Philadelphia. He is the one of the two founders of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first Black congregation in the United States. And just a couple weeks after Washington dies, he delivers this sermon to his congregation in South Philadelphia, where he really tells them that they should be mourning Washington's death alongside their fellow countrymen, because he said that Washington was not insensible to our sufferings, that he believed African Americans had a right to liberty, and that he knows that because he freed the people that he enslaved in his will. And this is kind of the beginning of this process that we see play out over the following 2 centuries, where you have these very different ways of interpreting Washington's history, either lifting up the emancipation or criticizing him as an unrepentant enslaver, or trying to ignore it altogether, all as a way of trying to advance their political or cultural priorities. And so the other example that you mentioned of these these stories that emerge in the middle of the 19th century of African Americans claiming to be the last living slave of George Washington. You mentioned they're all, each one is kind of less believable than the last. It always involves a person who is 105 or 110 or 121 years old, and trying to claim for themselves some little piece of notoriety, and potentially, kind of local fame by telling this story. And if it ended up in the newspaper, it's probably a story that they were telling again and again. And what you see happening at Mount Vernon, what you see happening elsewhere, is that African Americans get very good at telling white people the kinds of stories that they wanted to hear about George Washington. And so they would invent these stories about how they knew him personally and how he was such a great guy, and how he was such a kindly enslaver, because that's how people wanted to see George Washington. They wanted to see him as sort of above this system, especially as the fight over slavery grows more contentious. But there are always people that are trying to pull different parts of his history with slavery into the conversation, often framing it in very, very different ways.
If George Washington was alive today and experiencing this 250th celebration and the various things that were going on, and if he heard how Americans were describing his legacy, champion of liberty, father of the country, what do you think would surprise him the most about what they were saying about him, but even also about the country in which he tried so hard to establish? What do you think would surprise him the most?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I'm not sure that he would be surprised at the level of sort of fame and myth that he had arrived at. We started to see some of that stuff even while he was still alive. His birthday, celebrating his birthday became a big thing even before he died, and then it only grows after that. And I think when he writes his will, he doesn't open it as George Washington, resident of Fairfax County, Virginia. He opens it, I, George Washington, citizen of the United States, and lately the president of thus. He knows that this is a document that is going to be read far beyond just the Fairfax County courthouse. And so I think he had this appreciation for his unique position in American society. And, he had an appreciation for the important symbolism of all of his actions. It's part of the reason why he doesn't speak publicly about slavery. It's part of the reason why he chooses the suit that he chooses for his inauguration. Part of the reason why he defers to Congress in all of these ways when he could have made himself king. It's part of the reason why he gives up power, which he's been praised for so many centuries now. So I think he recognized the position that he was in, and maybe would have, wouldn't be surprised that he's been lifted up in this way for so long. But I think he would be, and this is obviously getting into speculation here, but I think he would be disappointed by the ways that the slavery issue proceeded in the years after he died, for one thing. I think we have a tendency as Americans to kind of collapse the history of slavery into a caricature of itself. Somehow everything, American slavery is always like 1850s Mississippi, right? It's big cotton plantations. It is, overseers looming over, enslaved men and women picking cotton. But that's not that's the image in popular culture of slavery. But that wasn't the slavery of the late 18th century Chesapeake, right? That wasn't how plantations functioned, and it wasn't how enslavers talked about their own involvement in the institution. People like Washington and Jefferson and many, many others of the Revolutionary era recognized the hypocrisy inherent in being so committed to founding this nation based on liberty and equality on the one hand, and being actively involved in enslaving other human beings on the other. They wanted to find a way out of it. They talked supportively of gradual abolition laws, or colonization and removal of emancipated people, but they recognized it as a problem, and they recognized it as something that should end. And by a generation later, by the time you get to the 1820s, 1830s, you have a total switch in the way that white enslavers are talking about the institution. They are then justifying it using, any political, legal, moral, biblical means that they could. And they are saying that it is a positive good, right? That it's good not just for them, not just for the country, it's good for enslaved people themselves. And I think how that developed would have surprised Washington. It seems like he was being naive to think that slavery could die out, and that slavery could slowly be ended in the way that he ended his personal involvement in it. But from the context of the late 18th century in the Chesapeake, like, it was realistic that this was the conversation that was happening. Tobacco production wasn't particularly profitable. Slavery wasn't particularly profitable by the late 18th century, early 19th century. And it's only the invention of the cotton gin and the removal of native people from the old Southwest that kind of gives slavery this second life. And so I think you would be surprised both at the life that slavery had for so long after his death, and then all of the social problems and our utter unwillingness to address problems of race across so much of American history.
Dr. Marks, you mentioned in your book about how Washington's manumission of his slaves was something that may have been a little less than extraordinary in Virginia at that particular time, and that other people around him in his situation were doing something of the same thing. They were, freeing some of their slaves. But of course, of the major founders, we think of James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, etc. He's the only one of the major founders who frees his slaves. So, what do you think it was about Washington's freeing his slaves that made his actions so important in American memory and in American history?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to look at this emancipation within the context, again, of late 18th century Virginia. There were many members of the revolutionary generation who used these devices, either deeds of manumission that they filed with the courthouse or their last will and testament, to free people that they enslaved. Because they had this recognition of the inconsistency and hypocrisy of slavery with the ideals of the new nation, they tried to rectify that using these kinds of manumissions in the late 18th century. So, for example, you see the free black population of Virginia explode between 1790 and about 1810, 1820. It more than triples in size as members of the Revolutionary era are filing these deeds and are beginning to die off. And so, in some sense, he was, in line with many of his fellow Virginians in taking this step. It wasn't altogether unheard of. There were people doing it before him that he would have recognized. Robert Carter had an emancipation that was even larger than George Washington's before he did. He would have known about that. And so it fits right in with the context of emancipation in late 18th century Virginia and the late 18th century Chesapeake. But no one had a higher profile or was looked at as a symbol more than George Washington was. And so I do think it matters that all of these other enslavers who were among, the first presidents, as you mentioned, Monroe, Madison, Jefferson, people like George Mason, other founders, they were all in that context alongside George Washington, and none of them took the step that George Washington did to free the people that he enslaved. And I think it is in part because he didn't have the debts that Jefferson had. He didn't have, children who he was, dispossessing of this, what was at the time valuable property. That certainly plays into this, but he also recognized his own symbolic importance in taking this step. And so I think a forthright and honest look at Washington's history with slavery has to include the impact of that emancipation at the end. And, like I've seen even other historians try to diminish that decision in his last will and testament by saying only one person, William Lee, his personal kind of valet, he's the only person who gained his freedom immediately in the will. Everyone else had it delayed for years, potentially for as long as Martha Washington lived. But and what I try to do in the third chapter of the book is to tell their stories, to explain what happened to them as free people and the lives and communities and institutions they were able to build for themselves, the ways that they very intentionally passed on the benefits of freedom to their children. I think an honest reckoning with Washington's history with slavery has to include all of that.
Yeah, you mentioned the one person who was freed at his death. Was that William Lee?
Yes.
Can you talk to our listeners real quick about what happened to him? I know it's maybe you do mention it a little bit in your book, but what became of him? Because he did stay there at Mount Vernon. He did not leave.
Yeah, so William Lee was enslaved by Washington for most of his life, and he really becomes Washington's personal servant during the Revolution and during his first years as president. He is by Washington's side all the time. He's, preparing him for the day. He's laying out his clothes. He's doing everything for Washington. He becomes this incredible equestrian because he has to keep up with Washington. He's serving him during the Revolution. He gains this he develops this relationship with Washington that none of the other people that Washington enslaved could claim. But he also acquired a lot of injuries in doing all of this work. He was thrown from horseback. He had terrible knee injuries, and so he ultimately gets demoted from being Washington's personal servant. He kind of gets demoted, and he becomes a shoemaker at Mount Vernon. He ends up gaining a reputation for drinking, probably to dull the pain of all of these injuries he had experienced while serving Washington. But in his will, Washington recognizes that this man had served him in a personal capacity, unlike all of the other people he enslaved, and so gives William Lee his freedom immediately. He doesn't have to wait until Martha Washington's death. He would be freed immediately after Washington died. But William Lee, he'd been, and there are others enslaved and freed by Washington who make this decision too. They had been deprived for the entirety of their lives of the opportunity to learn, to develop skills, to develop relationships that they could use to build lives for themselves in freedom. Lee was, handicapped by the time he gains his freedom. He had little opportunity to really build a meaningful and sustainable life for himself in freedom. And so he chooses, and Washington knows this is going to be a possibility. He puts this into his will. He chooses to stay at Mount Vernon and kind of is provided for through the funds from Washington's estate. And he becomes something of a minor celebrity at Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon, long before it becomes a historic site and museum, Mount Vernon is a national shrine for people. Americans visit, they want to be in the place where Washington lived, they want to take a souvenir, a stick off a tree or a brick from the path and take it with them. And they want to, and people are still enslaved there while they are going and visiting. And William Lee is one of those people. And they would talk to him about Washington, and he would get, tips and accolades from people for telling these stories about his experiences with Washington. As I mentioned earlier, many other enslaved people do that too. But most of those stories were totally invented. William Lee stories were legitimate and true.
Dr. Marks, you've provided a fascinating look into the importance of claiming both history as well as memory and looking at the life of Washington and what that leads for us. And I wanted to take just a few final minutes to give you the opportunity. I know you're really, really excited about July 4th that's upcoming, but maybe tell our listeners kind of what other things are in the works for you. What are some of the other projects you're thinking about working on? How can people find you you online because I know from me, I have enjoyed our conversation. It has been just remarkable just listening to you tell some of these stories. And so maybe just give our listeners just a little what's to come from Dr. Marks.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I've really enjoyed this. I always enjoy talking about the book, and I've found that audiences really appreciate the opportunity to think about some of these issues that are not as black and white as many people like to say, and to be able to engage with them in the kind of with the kind of depth and complexity that I think they deserve. And so, a lot of what I've been doing this spring, the book came out in April. A lot of what I've been doing this spring and will continue doing for the rest of the year is going around and talking about the book at museums, at universities, at historic sites, and have a lot of those booked this year. Always looking to add more. And so you can check my personal website. It's johngmarks.com. It has all the speaking events that I'll be doing in the year to come. I'm also doing some more freelance writing now that the book is out. And so I have a couple of essays coming out this summer, trying to make the most of my 250th anniversary knowledge before it expires. And so I have a couple of essays coming out this summer that those will be linked on my website as well. But I'm also launching right into another book project that I'm starting to research about another famous American who we often misunderstand. But you'll have to stay tuned for more on that one. I'm going to keep that one pretty close to the vest for the time being.
All right. Well, Dr. Marks, thanks for joining us today on the podcast. Like Chris said, we've really enjoyed our discussion with you. And good luck as you continue promoting your book and looking at the 250th anniversary of the United States.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Happy semi-quincentennial. Hope to see you all or see some folks out there at events over the coming year.
Ray, what a fascinating interview. I really enjoyed spending some time with Dr. Marks and just powerful storyteller. So I know that you're almost finished with the book as well. And so it's just a lot of great insight for our listeners as well as us to be able to sit down and have a chat with them.
It was very informative. I really enjoyed getting to hear him talk about a subject for which he is very passionate, quite obviously. He spent a long time researching the book, Thy Will Be Done, and the passion and the knowledge that he has for the topic of George Washington, slavery and memory really came through, I thought, in this interview. Again, I would definitely tell our listeners, if they're interested, to go to Amazon or wherever you buy your books and get a copy of Thy Will Be Done, George Washington's Legacy of Slavery and the Fight for American Memory. Check it out at your local library. If they don't have it, request them to have it. So, Chris, I'm really enjoying the guest we've been having. Of course, this is sort of a new direction for the podcast. We're going to continue doing our regular episodes, but we're going to start throwing in more guests from time to time. And I'm really enjoying it, getting to sit down with these scholars and authors and hear more about what they've got to say.
Yeah, it's a great way to end our 189th episode. And so we invite listeners, we want to go back all the way back to episode number one, all the way to the rest. There's a variety of different topics. There's a lot of very interesting things that we've talked about and discussed. And honestly, it's just two guys who enjoy the study of history and talking about history, but also understanding the impact that it has on everyday life. So we encourage our listeners to wherever they have their local, their podcast, wherever they find their latest edition, to go and to grab a copy and share it with somebody else and leave us a comment about something that really impressed you or something that struck you with our latest podcast. So sounds good. Great opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, listeners, check us out on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to give us a follow, like, and subscribe. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.